For most of the 20th century, the middle class was not merely a social category. It was an economic design. Its function was to stabilize consumption, legitimize the political order, and provide a predictable life cycle of work, savings, and retirement. The formula was simple. Education would secure employment. Employment would secure a home, and disciplined saving would secure the future. This architecture did not require exceptional insight. It required compliance with a system that rewarded continuity. That architecture no longer governs the real economy. What persists today is the appearance of stability rather than its substance. Employment still exists, home ownership still exists, and retirement accounts still exist. But the economic logic that once made these elements sufficient has quietly been replaced by a different regime, one in which asset ownership, not labor participation, determines long-term outcomes. The middle class continues to operate according to a model designed for a system that has already been dismantled. The most significant change is not cultural, it is structural. Over the last 4 decades, advanced economies transitioned from production-centered systems to financialized systems. In the older model, growth was primarily driven by expanding industrial output, and wages rose alongside productivity. In the newer model, growth is driven by asset appreciation, leverage, and capital markets. Productivity still increases, but wages no longer track it in any meaningful way. The surplus no longer flows to labor. It flows to balance sheets. This divergence is not an accident. It is a feature of how modern capital systems allocate rewards. The median household now lives inside a contradiction. It is told that it is participating in a growing economy, yet its purchasing power erodes. It is told that it is accumulating wealth, yet its balance sheet remains fragile. Its primary asset is typically a residence that produces no cash flow and is financed with long-term debt. Its primary income source is labor, which is exposed to automation, globalization, and policy shocks. Its savings are often parked in instruments that struggle to outpace monetary expansion. From a balance sheet perspective, this is not stability. It is leverage without control. The structure of assets and liabilities matters more than their size. A household that holds mostly non-productive assets and depends primarily on wage income is not positioned to benefit from a financialized economy. It is positioned to subsidize it. When asset prices inflate, access becomes more expensive. When monetary policy expands, the real value of cash and wages is that when volatility arrives, the household absorbs the shock directly through employment risk. Inflation, in this context, is not merely a rise in consumer prices. It functions as a structural tax on those who hold their wealth in currency, deposits, or fixed income claims. Asset holders experience inflation as appreciation. Wage earners experience it as erosion. This asymmetry compounds over time. It does not require crisis to be destructive. It only requires persistence. The middle class is therefore not failing because it is irresponsible or uninformed. It is failing because it is positioned on the wrong side of the compounding equation. Compounding in modern economies is increasingly reserved for capital rather than labor. Assets that can be leveraged, scaled, and repriced upward benefit from both financial engineering and policy design. Labor, by contrast, is constrained by contracts, competition, and political limits. Even when wages rise nominally, they rarely rise faster than the cost of access to assets. This creates a quiet but decisive shift in social mechanics. Participation in the economy no longer guarantees participation in its upside. There is also a psychological dimension to this structure. The middle class is trained to prioritize safety, credentials, and predictability. These traits were rational in a stable, production-based system. In a capital-based system, they become liabilities. The system rewards ownership, asymmetry, and exposure to scalable outcomes. Yet most households are culturally and institutionally guided away from these positions. They are guided toward careers instead of enterprises, toward savings instead of assets, toward consumption milestones instead of capital bases. This is not a conspiracy. It is a legacy. The education to employment pipeline was built for an earlier economic order. It still produces competent workers. It does not produce owners. As a result, the middle class increasingly occupies a role that is economically necessary but strategically weak. It provides labor, demand, and political legitimacy. But it does not control the systems that extract long-term value from these functions. It experiences growth as cost. It experiences stability as fragility. It experiences success as maintenance rather than expansion. The most dangerous aspect of this condition is that it feels normal. There is no single moment when the model collapses. There is only a gradual realization that decades of correct behavior have produced insufficient strategic position. The household did what it was told. It studied, worked, saved, and avoided obvious mistakes. Yet it remains exposed to the same vulnerabilities year after year. Employment risk, inflation risk, and policy risk. This is not a personal failure. It is a structural one. The middle class is not underperforming. It is correctly executing a strategy that no longer leads where it once did. The map is outdated. The terrain has changed. And in a system governed by compounding, starting from the wrong position is not a small error. It is a permanent one, unless corrected. To understand the exit from this condition, it is first necessary to understand how wealth actually forms in the modern capital system and why the rules governing it are fundamentally different from the rules most people are taught to follow. The central confusion in most economic planning begins with a false equivalence. The belief that income and wealth are variations of the same phenomenon. They are not. Income is a flow. Wealth is a stock. Income is linear and conditional. Wealth is exponential and self-reinforcing. A system that rewards capital accumulation will always produce outcomes that cannot be reached through income alone, regardless of how high that income appears. This distinction is not philosophical. It is mechanical. Income is produced by time-bound effort. It stops when effort stops. It is taxed first, exposed to inflation second, and only partially convertible into durable financial position. Wealth, by contrast, is produced by ownership. It persists independently of time input. It benefits from compounding, leverage, and repricing. It is often taxed last, and in many cases, taxed differently or deferred altogether. In a financialized economy, this difference becomes decisive. Compounding is the governing force behind modern wealth formation. But compounding does not operate on wages. It operates on capital bases. A wage can increase, but it does not recursively generate itself. Over time, the growth rate of the asset base matters more than the size of the initial contribution. This is why timing and positioning dominate intensity of effort. Two individuals can exert similar effort over similar time horizons and arrive at fundamentally different outcomes depending on whether their surplus is converted into compounding systems or consumed by non-productive obligations. The architecture of compounding also explains why early asset positioning has outsized effects. The difference between starting at 25 and starting at 40 is not 15 years of contributions. It is 15 years of missed recursive growth. In systems governed by exponential curves, delays are not linear costs. They are structural penalties. This leads to the next critical distinction: productive assets versus non-productive assets. A productive asset is one that generates cash flow, appreciates due to its role in a value-producing system, or ideally, both. It participates in economic activity. A non-productive asset may store value or provide utility, but it does not expand the owner's capital base. Many households believe they are accumulating wealth when they are in fact accumulating storage or consumption. The most common example is the primary residence. It may appreciate nominally, but it does not generate distributable cash flow. It requires continuous capital input for maintenance, taxes, and financing costs. From a portfolio perspective, it is often the largest capital concentration in a household, yet it is economically It is a place to live, not a machine for capital expansion. This concentration of capital into non-productive assets is one of the defining balance sheet weaknesses of the middle class. The ownership class by contrast, organizes its balance sheets around cash flowing and scalable systems, businesses, equity stakes, real estate designed for yield, and financial instruments that participate in enterprise growth. These assets are not merely held. They are structured. They are optimized for reinvestment and leverage. Leverage, in this context, is not primarily a risk. It is a tool. In institutional finance, leverage is used to control large asset bases with relatively small amounts of equity. Provided the underlying assets produce reliable cash flows, the risk is not in the existence of leverage. The risk is in mismatched leverage borrowing against assets that do not produce income or whose value depends on unstable assumptions. Households are taught to fear leverage while simultaneously being encouraged to take on the least productive form of it. Long-term debt, secured by non-cash flowing assets and serviced by labor income. Institutions, meanwhile, use leverage to expand ownership of productive systems. This is not a coincidence. It is a design difference. The deeper structural divide is therefore not between rich and poor, but between owners and non-owners. Receive distributions, appreciation, and option. Non-owners receive wages and exposure to cost increases. Owners benefit from policy decisions that support asset markets. Non-owners experience those same decisions as higher entry prices. The tax system reinforces this divide. Income is taxed immediately and predictably. Capital gains are taxed later, often at different rates, and sometimes not at all if structured correctly. Debt used for productive purposes is often subsidized. Ever wonder why it feels like you're running on a treadmill, working hard but never really getting ahead financially? You're not alone. For many in the middle class, building wealth feels like an impossible dream. But why is that? Today, we're diving deep into the 5 hidden bottlenecks that are silently draining your ability to build capital. Let's break them down. First up is the education to employment funnel. We're told to go to school, get good grades, and land a stable job. Sounds great, right? But this path often funnels us into a mindset where our income is tied directly to our labor. We trade time for money. The problem is, you only have so much time in a day. This linear income model has a built-in ceiling, making it incredibly difficult to achieve exponential financial growth. You become a well-paid employee, but not necessarily a wealth builder. Your primary financial tool is your salary, not assets that work for you. Next, we fall into the consumption trap. As our income grows, so does our lifestyle. We get a raise and immediately think about a bigger house, a fancier car, or more expensive vacations. Society and social media constantly bombard us with images of what a successful life looks like, and it almost always involves spending. This keeping up with the Joneses mentality creates a cycle of lifestyle inflation where expenses rise to meet, or even exceed income. The result? Very little is left over for saving or investing. You're essentially working to maintain a certain standard of living, not to build a foundation of wealth. The third bottleneck is what I call the risk narrative. The middle class is often taught to be rich. A penny saved is a penny earned. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. While this advice isn't wrong, it's often misinterpreted as avoid all risk. So, we put our money in safe places like savings accounts or fixed deposits where the returns barely keep up with inflation. In reality, our money is losing purchasing power every single day. The wealthy, on the other hand, understand that calculated risk is essential for growth. They invest in assets like stocks, real estate, and businesses, things that have the potential for significant returns, even if they come with volatility. By fearing risk, we inadvertently choose the certainty of slow financial erosion. Then there's the liquidity illusion. This is the belief that having cash readily available is the ultimate form of financial security. We like seeing a healthy balance in our checking or savings account because it feels safe and accessible. However, large amounts of idle cash are as we just mentioned, inflation eats away at its value. True financial security doesn't come from having cash on hand. It comes from owning productive assets that generate income and appreciate over time. An overemphasis on liquidity means your money isn't working for you. It's just sitting there, losing its power. Finally, we have time. This is perhaps the most subtle but most damaging bottleneck. We spend countless hours working for money, but how much time do we spend learning how to make our money work for us? Most people spend more time planning their next vacation than they do planning their financial future. We scroll social media, watch Netflix, and pursue hobbies, all of which are fine in moderation. But if we don't intentionally carve out time to learn about personal finance, investing, and wealth-building strategies, we'll remain stuck. Your most valuable asset isn't just your money. It's your time and your knowledge. Misallocating your time means you're neglecting the very engine that can drive your financial growth. So, what can we do? It starts with a mindset shift. Recognize that your job is just one tool for income, not the whole toolbox. Actively fight lifestyle inflation by creating a gap between what you earn and what you spend, and then invest that difference. Reframe your understanding of risk. See it not as something to be avoided, but as something to be understood and managed. Move your money from idle cash into productive assets. And most importantly, invest your time in your financial education. Read books, listen to podcasts, watch videos like this one. Breaking free from these bottlenecks isn't easy, but it is possible. It requires conscious effort and a change in perspective. By understanding these traps, you can start to navigate around them and begin your journey toward true financial independence. The strategic repositioning framework: if the middle class is constrained primarily by structure rather than by effort, then any viable response must also operate at the level of structure. Tactical improvements, better budgeting, marginally better investment selection, or incremental income increases do not change strategic position. They optimize performance inside a model that remains fundamentally misaligned with how modern wealth compounds. The first step in repositioning is therefore a reframing of the objective. In a financialized economy, the primary goal is not career maximization. It is capital base maximization. Career, employment, and professional skills are inputs into this process, and income is not the score. It is the fuel. Every major decision: education, location, lifestyle, and time allocation must be evaluated primarily by its impact on long-term ownership capacity. This reframing immediately alters the meaning of success. Stability without ownership is not security. It is dependency with better aesthetics. From this perspective, capital strategy can be understood in three broad phases. The first phase is positioning and accumulation. The objective here is not optimization, it is speed of entry. The priority is to build an initial capital base and, more importantly, to gain early exposure to compounding systems. This may involve aggressive saving, asymmetric career choices, or participation in small, imperfect ventures. The specific vehicle is less important than the fact of ownership and reinvestment. In this phase, the main enemy is delay. The second phase is the construction of cash flow engines. Here, the objective shifts from accumulation to self-reinforcement. Capital must begin to produce surplus that is not dependent on continuous personal labor. This surplus is then recycled into additional assets, businesses, or ownership stakes. The household begins to transition from a labor-funded balance sheet to a partially capital-funded one. The third phase is scaling and systemization. At this point, the primary constraint is no longer capital but attention and structure. The focus moves toward building or acquiring systems that can grow with minimal, incremental input. Enterprises, platforms, portfolios, or networks that benefit from size and leverage. These phases are not strictly sequential, but they describe a progression from dependence to partial autonomy to structural leverage. Asset selection within this framework is not about fashion or prediction. It is about function. A strategically useful asset has at least one of three properties. It produces cash flow, it participates in scalable growth, or it provides control over a value-producing process. Ideally, it does more than one. Assets that merely store value or provide personal utility are not central to capital-based expansion, regardless of how socially validated they may be. This functional view immediately disqualifies many popular investments from being treated as strategic assets. Career must also be reinterpreted. In a capital-first framework, employment is not an identity. It is a capital extraction mechanism. Its value lies in three outputs: surplus, cash, skill, acquisition, and network access. A career path that maximizes salary but minimizes optionality or learning may be inferior to one that pays less but accelerates access to ownership opportunities or strategic knowledge. Credential accumulation in this context is only justified if it materially improves access to capital flows or control points. Otherwise, it is a costly delay. Risk management must also be redefined. The conventional approach treats stability of income and preservation of nominal capital as the primary goals. In a system dominated by compounding, this is insufficient. The more relevant objective is structural resilience, the ability to survive, adapt, and continue reinvesting across multiple economic regimes. This implies diversification of income sources, not just diversification of financial instruments. It implies building optionality in skills, networks, and ownership positions. It implies accepting controlled volatility in exchange for reduced long-term dependency on any single institution or policy environment. Safety is not the absence of fluctuation. It is the absence of single points of failure. Finally, time must be treated as a strategic asset rather than merely as a resource to be sold. In compounding systems, the highest return use of time is often the establishment of ownership positions that will outlive the direct labor invested in them. This requires periods of disproportionate effort and tolerance for uncertainty. It also requires resisting the social pressure to equate visible consumption with progress. The purpose of this framework is not to produce rapid or guaranteed outcomes. It is to change the direction of compounding. A household that reorients around capital-based expansion may still experience setbacks, cycles, and long periods of slow progress. The difference is that these experiences occur inside a structure that, over time, tends to widen options rather than narrow them. The middle class does not require encouragement. It requires a different strategic doctrine, one that treats ownership, not employment, as the central organizing principle of economic life. Such a doctrine does not promise comfort. It promises alignment with how the system actually works. And in a compounding world, alignment is not an advantage. It is the minimum condition for not falling permanently behind.